Security was on stage. The audience was screaming. But when Jerry raised his hand to silence everyone, a small girl let go of her mother's hand and walked straight toward him. The Jerry Springer Show. Studio 7 in Chicago. March 2003. The audience was already on their feet, chanting, "Jerry! Jerry! Jerry!" with that familiar tribal rhythm that meant chaos was brewing. Two women sat in the confrontation chairs on stage, barely 3 feet apart, their body language screaming violence about to happen. Security guards Steve and Tony stood between them, hands ready, eyes alert. This was standard Springer. Expected Springer. The kind of explosive confrontation that made the show infamous. But something was different today. Something the audience didn't know yet. The woman on the left, Maria Santos, 28 years old, wearing jeans and a simple white blouse, kept glancing toward the backstage entrance. Not at her opponent. Not at Jerry. At that dark curtain where guests entered the stage. She was waiting for someone. Jerry Springer stood to the side with his microphone, that familiar calm expression on his face. The look of a man who had seen everything and was mildly amused by all of it. He gestured for the audience to quiet down just enough for him to speak. All right, Jerry said, his voice carrying that distinctive blend of authority and irony. So Maria, you're here today because you have something to tell Crystal. Something you've been hiding for 3 years. Crystal Martinez, the woman in the other chair, leaned forward aggressively. Whatever she's got to say, she should have said it 3 years ago when she destroyed my family. The audience erupted. Maria's jaw clenched. Security shifted position. Jerry raised his hand. The chanting stopped. The entire studio went silent. But this wasn't the silence that usually came before an explosion. This was different. Something in Jerry's face had changed. He was looking toward the backstage entrance, his expression unreadable. Before we continue, Jerry said slowly, Maria has asked to bring someone onto the stage. Someone who wasn't here 3 years ago. Maria stood up. Her hands were shaking. Crystal looked confused, her anger momentarily interrupted by curiosity. The backstage curtain parted. A little girl walked onto the stage. 6 years old, maybe 7. She wore a bright yellow dress with small flowers on it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She walked with the kind of careful confidence that children have when they're trying very hard to be brave. The audience's energy shifted instantly. The Jerry Springer crowd knew how to read a room. They'd come for scandal and chaos. But a child changed everything. You could feel 300 people collectively holding their breath. The little girl walked directly to Maria, who dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around her daughter. The embrace lasted 3 seconds. Then the little girl pulled back, looked at her mother's tear-stained face, and did something no one expected. She let go of her mother's hand and started walking toward Jerry Springer. Maria whispered something. Mija, no, stay here. But the little girl kept walking. Across the stage. Past the empty chairs. Past the security guards who stood frozen, uncertain whether this was in the script. Jerry lowered his microphone. He watched this tiny human being walking toward him with complete determination, and something in his expression cracked, just for a moment. That mask of ironic detachment slipped. The little girl stopped directly in front of Jerry and looked up at him. She didn't say anything. She just stared at him with those wide, serious eyes that children have when they're trying to communicate something important. Jerry Springer, the man who had hosted thousands of episodes, who had seen every variation of human chaos, who prided himself on never being surprised, knelt down on one knee to meet the little girl at eye level. Hi there, Jerry said quietly. His microphone was lowered, but the boom mics picked up his voice anyway. What's your name? Isabella, the girl said. I'm 6.5. 6.5, Jerry repeated. That's a very important age. My mommy said you're the man who helps people tell the truth. The studio was completely silent. Even the cameras seemed to move more carefully, as if afraid to break whatever was happening. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 3 years earlier. March 2000. The same studio. A different episode. The title card had read, "I slept with my sister's husband." Classic Springer territory. Maria Santos, 25 years old and 8 months pregnant, had walked onto that stage to confess that she'd been having an affair with her sister's husband for over a year. The chaos had been immediate and predictable. Crystal Martinez, Maria's older sister, had attacked her before Jerry could even finish the introduction. Security had pulled them apart. The audience had chanted and screamed. Crystal's husband hadn't even shown up to the taping. He'd sent word through producers that he was filing for divorce from both of them. But there had been a moment near the end of that 2000 episode that the cameras had caught but the editors had cut from the broadcast. During a commercial break, while security held Crystal back and the audience buzzed with energy, Jerry had walked over to where Maria sat hunched in her chair, crying, one hand on her swollen belly. "Is the baby his?" Jerry had asked quietly, off mic. Maria had nodded, unable to speak. "Does he know?" She had shaken her head. Jerry had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd said something that Maria would never forget. 3 years from now, when that baby asks you why her father isn't around, what are you going to tell her? That you had your moment of truth on my show and then went back to hiding? The segment had ended. Maria had walked off stage. The episode had aired without that conversation. Life had gone on. But Jerry Springer had remembered. What the audience didn't know, what Crystal didn't know, was that Jerry's producers had received a letter 6 months ago. From Maria. It was 4 pages long, handwritten, and it explained everything that had happened after that 2000 episode. The baby, Isabella, had been born 3 weeks after the taping. Crystal's husband had disappeared, abandoned both women, and was now somewhere in Florida with a new girlfriend. Crystal had spent 3 years blaming Maria for destroying her marriage, not knowing that the man they both loved had already had 2 other families in different states. But Maria's letter wasn't about blame or excuses. It was a request. She wanted to come back. She wanted to face Crystal again. But this time, she wanted to bring Isabella. She wanted her daughter to see her mother tell the truth, the whole truth, not just the scandalous version that made for good television. And she wanted Crystal to meet her niece. Jerry's producers had thought it was insane. "You can't bring a 6-year-old onto Springer," they'd argued. "It goes against everything the show is about." But Jerry had read that letter 3 times. And he'd made a decision that surprised everyone who worked for him. "Bring her back," he'd told his producers. "But we do it differently this time." Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Now, in March 2003, Jerry was kneeling on his stage looking at Isabella Santos, and the weight of that decision was pressing down on him. "Your mommy's right," Jerry said to Isabella. "I try to help people tell the truth. But sometimes the truth is really hard. Are you here to help your mommy tell the truth?" Isabella nodded seriously. Then she reached into the pocket of her yellow dress and pulled out a photograph. It was creased and worn, like it had been carried around for a long time. She held it out to Jerry. He took it carefully. The photograph showed 2 little girls, maybe 8 and 10 years old, sitting on a front porch with their arms around each other. They were laughing at something off camera. On the back, in faded pen, someone had written, "Maria and Crystal, Summer 1983. Jerry stared at the photograph for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes found Maria, still kneeling where her daughter had left her. "Where did she get this?" Jerry asked. "I gave it to her," Maria said, her voice shaking. "I wanted her to know that her aunt and I used to be best friends. Before I ruined everything. Before I became the person who destroys families." Crystal, still sitting in her confrontation chair, had gone completely still. She was staring at the photograph in Jerry's hand, and something in her face was changing. Jerry stood up slowly. He looked at Isabella. "Sweetheart, can you do me a favor?" Can you go sit with your mom for just a minute while I talk to your Aunt Crystal? Isabella nodded and walked back to Maria, who pulled her daughter into her lap and buried her face in the child's hair. Jerry walked over to Crystal. He held out the photograph. Crystal took it with trembling hands. She looked at it for maybe 5 seconds. Then her face collapsed and she started crying, not the angry, bitter crying of betrayal, but the deep, broken crying of loss. I haven't seen this picture in 20 years, Crystal whispered. This was the summer before Mom died. We were happy. Crystal, Jerry said quietly, I need to tell you something that Maria doesn't even know I know. He gestured for a production assistant, who brought out a manila folder. Jerry opened it and pulled out a stack of papers. Legal documents. Police reports. Hospital records. After your episode aired in 2000, Jerry continued, my team does follow-ups. We try to track what happens to our guests. We found out that your husband, the man you and Maria were fighting over, had been arrested in Florida 6 months after your episode. He'd been running a con. Multiple women. Multiple families. He was already married when he married you. And he had another family in Tampa when he was seeing Maria. Crystal's mouth fell open. She looked at Maria, who was crying silently, still holding Isabella. You were both victims, Jerry said. You didn't destroy each other's lives. He did. And you've wasted 3 years hating your sister for something that wasn't her fault. What Jerry didn't say, what he would never say on camera, was that he'd used his own money to hire the private investigator who'd track down all of this information. That he'd spent the last 6 months personally making sure every document was verified before bringing Maria and Crystal back. Behind the scenes, Jerry made a decision that no producer had ever seen him make before. The audience was completely silent. Some were crying. Others looked confused. This wasn't the Springer they'd come to see. This was something else entirely. Crystal stood up from her chair. She walked across the stage toward Maria. Security tensed, ready to intervene if she attacked. But Crystal didn't attack. She dropped to her knees in front of Maria and Isabella. Her hands were shaking as she reached out. Can I hold her? Crystal asked, her voice breaking. Can I meet my niece? Maria nodded, crying too hard to speak. She gently guided Isabella toward Crystal. The little girl looked uncertain. She glanced back at her mother, who nodded encouragement. Then Isabella reached out and touched Crystal's face with one small hand. Mommy says you look just like Grandma, Isabella said seriously. The one in heaven. Crystal let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She pulled Isabella into a hug and buried her face in the child's shoulder. Maria joined them. The three of them, 2 sisters and a little girl, held each other in the middle of the Jerry Springer stage while 300 people watched in absolute silence. Jerry Springer stood 10 feet away, his microphone hanging loosely at his side. He wasn't looking at the camera. He wasn't playing to the audience. He was just watching. And if you looked very carefully, if you knew what to look for, you could see the slight tremor in his jaw. The way he blinked just a little too fast. The way his hand tightened around the microphone. This was Jerry's equivalent of breaking down. This was as close as he would ever come to losing control. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Isabella pulled back from Crystal's embrace. She reached into her pocket and pulled out another photograph, this one newer. It showed Isabella on her 6th birthday, blowing out candles. She held it out to Crystal. Mommy said you missed all my birthdays, Isabella said. But you can come to the next one. Crystal took the photograph with shaking hands and nodded, unable to speak. Jerry finally stepped forward. He addressed the audience, his voice steady but softer than anyone had ever heard it. You came here today expecting a fight, Jerry said. You came expecting chaos. But sometimes the truth isn't about revenge. Sometimes it's about finding your way back to the people you love. The audience rose to their feet. Not chanting. just applauding. Some crying openly. Share and subscribe, so this story will never be forgotten. After the taping, Jerry did his final thought in an empty studio, something he'd never done before. "Take care of yourselves," he said quietly to the camera. "And each other. Because family isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up. Even when it takes 3 years." The photograph of the two sisters from 1983 stayed on Jerry's desk until the show ended in 2009. Crystal attended every one of Isabella's birthdays. Maria and Crystal reconciled fully within 6 months. And Isabella Santos grew up knowing that sometimes the truth requires a stage, a brave little girl, and a man who believed people deserved a second chance.